I'm David Grayson, one of the co-editors of Cranfield on Corporate Sustainability. And I'm here today to interview Sharon Jackson, who is the author of a chapter on sense and sustainability, which is all about how you need to use the whole question of sense making to help you to implement sustainability through the organisation. So first of all, Sharon, for those of us who are not so familiar with sense making, what is it?
What is it? Well, maybe I'll step back very quickly and say why I was interested in the idea of sense making. I've been curious for some time why big organisations have amazing sustainability principles and reports and communications material, but somehow people don't seem to interpret that material in the same way and don't particularly enact the principles. So I looked into this phenomenon and found in the academic fields the theory of sense making, which talks about how people select and deselect different data and different information depending on other things going on in their lives. So at bottom level principles, sense making is how we make sense of all the things that are going on around in our life and picking out, really subconsciously picking out those bits of information that make information plausible for us. So really it's about interpretation, how people interpret what their company is expecting from them in terms of sustainability.
So how can sense making or interpretation, how can it help organisations to make better progress to implement sustainability in their own operations?
Good question. Well, my interest is actually about how collective sense making might occur. So my findings of my research so far are, for sure, we all interpret all information in a particular way. And does it really matter if we turn off excessive lights to reduce CO2 and reduce energy? Does it matter why we do that? If our interpretation is because we care about climate change, or we're reducing costs, or it's a KPI, does it matter what sense we make? That's one of the questions I'm still dealing with, to be honest. But I'm really then taking that phenomenon into when there's a very big project, and actually it's quite important that a collective of people, a group of people, have the same interpretation. What gets in the way? When people are selecting information in their minds, how can that interpretation become more collective and congruent to the aims of the organisation? So to build on that, what I've looked at is the influence of the culture of the organisation and what we call social identity. Do these groups of people make sense of their identity of their organisation in the same way? And how does that affect how they interpret sustainability?
So there's a whole series of things going on in terms of the willingness, the ability of employees in an organisation to support and help to implement sustainability, which is nothing to do with the issue itself or with the idea of trying to improve social and environmental and economic impacts. It may have a lot to do with some entirely extraneous ideas about how you perceive your employer.
Oh, very much so. That's one of the key themes that are coming out from my research, which is still ongoing. Two very key themes around that are, one is the leadership in the organisation. Where people see a disconnect with leadership behaviour from the espoused sustainability principles, the people deselect those principles as not really being relevant in their role. That's a very key theme. So in terms of leadership for sustainability, it's a subject that's well written on, and we kind of intrinsically know this to be true, but to be observing it through research is obviously very, very useful.
And of course, Donald Ladkin
Yes.
has written a chapter in the book as well around leading for sustainability.
So the congruence of that leadership, I'm saying, is actually vital to whether people, and remember this is a subconscious process. People, and what also is interesting, because it's subconscious, sometimes the interpretation is that we are doing this act of sustainability, when actually there's no evidence of any inaction whatsoever. So that's also an interesting phenomenon, how people almost create a narrative, a story in their head around their sense making, about believing that we are really doing this. And we've seen that in some of the other studies where CEO studies say, yes, 98% of CEOs think we really are enacting our sustainability. They genuinely do believe that. I can see that. And I'm interested in unpicking how that narrative, that interpretation could get slightly skew with from reality. And the second thing, of course, is just general communications. The communications in organisations needs to be congruent with, of course, sustainability principles, but those underpinning stories and conversations about who we are as an organisation. If there's a disconnect there, this also becomes a barrier to people actually making sense of the sustainability principles.
So if you're thinking about some good practice advice to a busy manager around that last point on storytelling, how would you frame that as practical things for a manager to be thinking about?
Well, one of the key pieces of feedback in my research is that, and I'm talking about operational managers, I'm not talking about CSR managers or sustainability managers, I'm talking about HR, marketing, general affairs, operational functions, which is where seems to be the difficulty in embedding sustainability from my experience. What generally people are saying is, they don't ask us what we think. There's not enough focus groups. There's not enough really open discussion about what we think about sustainability in our organisation. They tend to say that the information comes down from up on high in a beautiful document, which a few of them read, I have to say. So then they are left to their own interpretation devices. So my advice is to really go out and find out from across the board from the operations what people make of sustainability in their organisation. And I think there's a lot of surprises there in terms of how diverse those interpretations are. And then find a way to communicate which actually attracts each of those different clusters of interpretation. Because that's also my other finding. You get groups of people in different parts of the organisation. You start to think in a similar way. So communicating perhaps across the organisation a slightly different way to address those different sense-making interpretations.
So some segmentation of your employee base based on their different sense-making.
Yes, they're clusters of sense-making, but also asking them, finding out what the languages they use, the storytelling in the organisation, what do they discuss by the coffee machine? Because frequently the communications around sustainability aren't aligned with everyday communications and conversations that people have, so they actually deselect it. It doesn't make sense to them.
Sharon Jackson, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.